Imagine a czar who made noble women dance naked on ice, who chased courtiers with crossbows down palace corridors, and who sealed entire cities in rings of fire just to hear the screams echo off frozen rivers. This is not myth or legend. It is the daily sport of Ivan the Fourth of Russia. Every cruelty you have heard is only the opening note of a reign composed in agony. When the winter winds howled through the Kremlin's stone corridors, Ivan's courtiers knew to fear more than the cold. The Tsar had discovered a new entertainment that would forever stain the marble floors with shame and blood. He called it his ice ballet, but there was nothing graceful about what unfolded in those snow-covered courtyards. Noble wives, women who had worn silk and ermine just hours before, found themselves stripped bare and thrust onto the frozen ground. Their husbands, Russia's most powerful boyars, could only watch in horror as their honor was torn away along with their wives' clothing. The guards beat their drums in steady rhythm, a metronome of humiliation that echoed off the palace walls like thunder. From his heated balcony, Ivan observed with the detached fascination of a natural philosopher studying specimens. He timed each woman's endurance, noting how long delicate flesh could withstand the bite of Russian winter before splitting open like overripe fruit. The Tsar's eyes gleamed as he watched feet turn blue, then black, as blood pooled beneath torn skin and froze into crimson ice. Some danced until they collapsed, their bodies betraying them, as hypothermia claimed consciousness. Others, driven by desperation or maternal instinct, continued their grotesque performance, even as their children's cries pierced the night air from the palace windows above. The drums never stopped, never slowed, marking time like a funeral dirge for dignity itself. Those who survived the ordeal, and precious few did, were granted fur cloaks, as if this gesture could somehow restore what had been stolen. But most were dragged away by silent servants, some to secret infirmaries where foreign physicians worked by candlelight to save limbs claimed by frostbite, others to dungeons where their suffering would continue in darkness if their husbands had somehow further displeased the Tsar. This was not random cruelty, but calculated political theater. Ivan understood that to break a man's spirit, you must first defile what he holds most sacred. By forcing Russia's greatest families to witness their women's degradation, he stripped away more than clothing. He tore apart the very fabric of noble honor that had held the realm together for centuries. The hunt had always been Ivan's favorite pastime, but within the Kremlin's wooden passageways, he had transformed this noble pursuit into something far more sinister. When darkness fell and the last courtier had retreated to his chambers, the Tsar would don his hunting leathers and select his prey from among the boyars who had displeased him that day. The rules were simple, yet terrifying, in their perversion of courtly tradition. The chosen nobles would be given a head start, perhaps the time it took to recite 3 prayers, before the torches were extinguished and the corridors plunged into absolute darkness. Then came the sound that froze blood in veins, the howling of hounds echoing through the palace halls, followed by the soft whisper of Ivan's footsteps as he stalked his human quarry. Armed with his hunting bow, the Tsar prowled through passages he had known since childhood, his intimate knowledge of every corner and hidden alcove giving him an insurmountable advantage. The arrows he used were no ordinary hunting bolts. These were tipped with iron heads and wrapped in cloth that had been soaked in lamp oil. A strike to the leg meant days in chains, writhing in agony as infection set in. A strike to the torso meant a slow, agonizing death in the palace dungeons, where screams would echo unheard through stone walls. The boyars stumbled through the darkness, their silk robes catching on rough wooden beams, their soft court shoes offering no protection against the splinters that littered the floor. Some tried to hide in alcoves or behind tapestries, but Ivan knew every hiding place, every secret passage. The hunt could last minutes or hours, depending on his mood and the entertainment value of his quarry's desperation, By dawn, servants would arrive with fresh rushes to cover the blood pools that had soaked into the wooden floors. They worked in silence, their faces carefully blank, knowing that to acknowledge what they had witnessed would mean joining the next hunt as prey rather than spectator. The palace would be restored to its daytime splendor, but the fear lingered in every shadow, in every corner, where a boyar might glance nervously, wondering if he would be selected for the evening's entertainment. This was Ivan's genius. He had taken the most civilized of pursuits, the hunt that symbolized nobility's mastery over nature, and corrupted it into a theater of mortal dread, where the natural order was not just inverted, but utterly destroyed. The oprichniki arrived like harbingers of apocalypse, their black robes billowing behind them as they rode their sable horses through village gates. Each man carried the same grisly trophies, severed dog heads dangling from their saddles and broomsticks strapped to their backs, symbols that spoke louder than any proclamation. The heads represented their sworn duty to bite and tear at treason like rabid hounds, while the brooms promised to sweep away every trace of disloyalty from Russian soil. But it was during their feasts that the true horror of Ivan's private guard revealed itself. What began as state banquets in requisitioned manor houses quickly degenerated into scenes that would have made pagan rituals seem civilized by comparison. Captives, often the very nobles whose estates had been seized, were forced to drink until they collapsed, their bodies convulsing as wine and vodka poisoned their systems. Then came the whips, cracking across flesh, while choirs of kidnapped monks sang psalms in voices cracked with terror. The juxtaposition was deliberate, sacred hymns mixing with screams of agony, creating a symphony of suffering that Ivan believed purified the realm. The oprichniki laughed as they worked, their faces flushed with alcohol and bloodlust, competing to see who could extract the most creative sounds from their victims. Some used heated irons to brand crosses into backs, others preferred the delicate art of removing fingernails one by one while maintaining their victims' consciousness. Those who proved most brutal in their service were rewarded with the finest prizes: land, gold, and most coveted of all, the right to select women from conquered villages. These unfortunates became brides of a night, taken to chambers where morning light would reveal bodies beaten beyond recognition or floating face down in manor house ponds. The oprichniki called it their marriage tax, payment for their service to the crown. Ivan had achieved something unprecedented in the history of statecraft. He had institutionalized sadism, binding private vice to public service in a way that made cruelty not just acceptable, but essential for advancement. The black-clad riders understood that their positions depended not on administrative skill or military prowess, but on their capacity for invention in the art of human suffering. Village mothers would cross themselves and whisper prayers when they saw those sable horses on the horizon, knowing that salvation lay not in resistance, but in the hope that their daughters might be too young, too old, or too plain to catch the attention of men who had made torture into a sacred duty. In January 1570, the ancient city of Novgorod learned what it meant to earn Ivan's suspicion. Whispers of imagined treason had reached the Tsar's ears, rumors that the proud merchant republic was planning to defect to Lithuania, to abandon Holy Russia for foreign protection. The evidence was fabricated, the accusations baseless, but Ivan's paranoia had metastasized beyond reason. He would make Novgorod an example that would echo through Russian history for centuries. The siege began not with armies, but with a single, terrifying command: seal the gates. No soul would enter or leave until Ivan's justice had been satisfied. The city's own guards, trembling with fear, barricaded the exits they had once protected, transforming Novgorod into a vast prison where 60,000 souls awaited their fate. The oprichniki spread through the streets like black plague, marking houses with crosses that meant death and triangles that promised only torture. Then came the march to the Volkhov River, where the ice stretched thick and white under the winter sun. Citizens were herded like cattle, their breath forming clouds of vapor that would soon be their last. The method was diabolical in its efficiency. Holes were chopped through the frozen surface, creating dark wounds in the white expanse that would serve as mass graves. The process was methodical, almost liturgical in its precision. Families were separated, parents forced to watch as their children were beaten with clubs and iron rods before being plunged through the ice. The city's bells tolled between each drowning, their bronze voices marking time like a funeral mass for an entire population. Those who tried to swim were pushed back under with long poles, their desperate fingers clawing at ice that offered no purchase, no salvation. But drowning was only one note in Ivan's symphony of destruction. Monasteries were looted, their sacred vessels melted down while monks were flayed alive in their own chapels. Babies were torn from mothers' arms and hurled from the city walls into snowdrifts below, their small bodies disappearing into white silence. Livestock were slaughtered not for food but for sport, their blood painting the snow crimson, while citizens slowly starved. The economic devastation was as calculated as the human cost. Warehouses were burned, trade records destroyed, merchant guilds dissolved in blood and flame. Ivan understood that to truly break a city's spirit, you must destroy not just its people, but its ability to rebuild, to remember, to hope. When the week of blood finally ended, Novgorod resembled a charnel house more than a city. Mass graves scarred the landscape like open wounds, and the survivors wandered through empty streets, like ghosts haunting their own lives. The Tsar had proven that an entire metropolis could be sacrificed to one ruler's paranoia, that tens of thousands of lives were worth less than the whim of a single man who wore the crown of all the Russias. November 1581 brought a domestic tragedy that would haunt Ivan's final years and doom his dynasty's future. The incident began with something as trivial as clothing. His pregnant daughter-in-law, Elena, wore what Ivan deemed immodest dress in the palace corridors. Perhaps her robes were too thin, or perhaps the aging Tsar's mind had finally snapped completely under the weight of decades of cruelty. Whatever the reason, Ivan's iron staff found Elena's belly with brutal precision. The young woman collapsed, blood pooling beneath her as she miscarried the child who might have secured the Rurik dynasty's continuation. But it was her husband's response that would seal both their fates. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the heir who had endured a lifetime of his father's madness, finally found his breaking point. For once, the prince stood against the monster who had terrorized Russia for 3 decades. The confrontation was swift and fatal. Father and son faced each other in the palace chambers, years of suppressed rage and shame boiling over into words that should never have been spoken. The Tsarevich accused his father of destroying Russia, of murdering innocents, of being unfit to rule God's chosen people. Ivan's response was as predictable as it was devastating. The same iron-tipped staff that had killed his grandchild now found his son's skull. Court physician Jerome Horsey, an Englishman who had served the Russian court for years, documented the desperate attempts to save the prince's life. The steel tip had penetrated deep into the temporal bone, sending fragments into the brain tissue that no medieval medicine could extract. Ivan the Terrible watched his heir's life drain away over 3 agonizing days, his own hands stained with the blood of his family's future. The scene revealed the fundamental tragedy of Ivan's character, his inability to separate paternal love from violent impulse. Even as he cradled his dying son, begging forgiveness through tears and prayers, his hands remained capable of only one language: violence. He had created a kingdom of fear so complete that even his own flesh and blood could not escape its reach. With his heir's death, Ivan had murdered more than his son. He had killed the dynasty itself. The remaining prince, Fyodor, was weak-minded and childless, ensuring that the Rurik line would die with him. In a moment of rage, the Tsar had destroyed centuries of royal bloodline, leaving Russia to face the chaos that would follow his own inevitable death. Between his massacres, Ivan retreated into a theater of piety that was perhaps more disturbing than his open cruelty. The same hands that had driven iron into his son's skull would fold in prayer before golden icons while tears streamed down cheeks that had smiled at torture. Donning the rough homespun robes of a monk, he would disappear into Russia's most sacred monasteries, seeking absolution for sins that no earthly confessor could forgive. These retreats were elaborate performances of contrition, choreographed displays of a tormented soul seeking redemption. Ivan would prostrate himself before ancient icons, pressing his forehead against cold stone floors until blood appeared, as if physical pain could somehow balance the cosmic scales of his crimes. The monks who witnessed these displays trembled not with awe, but with terror, knowing that the man weeping before their altar had ordered entire cities drowned beneath winter ice. From these sacred refuges, Ivan penned letters that revealed the depths of his self-deception. Page after page flowed from his quill, blaming the boyars for Russia's suffering, casting himself as a reluctant avenger, forced to bloody his hands for the good of the realm. These documents painted him as a martyr to his own crown, a man driven to necessary cruelty by the treachery of others. The contradiction was staggering, a killer seeking sympathy for the burden of killing. But even his pilgrimages served darker purposes than spiritual renewal. The monasteries became extensions of his surveillance network, their inhabitants transformed into unwitting spies for the throne. Monks reported village gossip, travelers' conversations, and whispered criticisms that would later feed the Oprichniki's blacklists. Sacred confessionals became sources of intelligence, with abbots compelled to share the secrets of penitent souls. The most disturbing aspect was Ivan's genuine belief in his own righteousness. He saw no hypocrisy in ordering mass executions by day and seeking divine forgiveness by night. In his twisted theology, brutality was simply God's will enacted through his chosen instrument. The monasteries offered not true repentance, but temporary respite from the exhausting work of being Russia's holy executioner. This cycle of violence and prayer, cruelty and contrition, created a spiritual paradox that infected the entire realm. If the Tsar himself could not distinguish between divine justice and demonic cruelty, how could his subjects hope to understand the difference between righteousness and sin? Within the fortress walls of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, Ivan's palace compound had become something far more sinister than a royal residence. It was a laboratory of human suffering, where the Tsar funded experiments that would have horrified even medieval inquisitors. Here, behind stone walls that muffled screams, foreign alchemists worked by candlelight to perfect the science of pain, while their sovereign watched with the fascination of a natural philosopher. The fire experiments were Ivan's particular obsession, conducted in chambers where iron cauldrons bubbled with concoctions of herbs and molten lead. These were not random acts of cruelty, but methodical studies in the limits of human endurance. Prisoners were lowered into the scalding mixtures in careful stages, first the feet, then the legs, then the torso, while court scribes recorded with clinical precision how long consciousness lingered at each level of immersion. The alchemists, desperate men who had accepted Ivan's patronage in exchange for their souls, were ordered to distill poisons of varying potency and design. Some victims received doses calculated to kill within minutes, others within hours or days. The Tsar was particularly interested in substances that would cause maximum agony while preserving the victim's ability to speak, ensuring they could confess to crimes both real and imagined before death claimed them. These laboratories doubled as instruments of diplomacy, though of the most twisted sort imaginable. Foreign envoys summoned to discuss trade agreements or territorial disputes found themselves conducted through chambers where human flesh sizzled in bronze vessels. The message was unmistakable. This was the fate that awaited kingdoms that crossed the Tsar of all the Russias. Negotiations were conducted with the smell of scorched flesh hanging heavy in the air, ambassadors struggling to maintain composure while witnessing atrocities that defied civilized understanding. Ivan's fascination with these experiments revealed something deeply disturbing about his character, a need to understand suffering not just as a political tool, but as a subject worthy of scholarly inquiry. He approached torture with the same intellectual curiosity that other rulers brought to astronomy or mathematics, seeking to catalog and quantify the precise mechanics of human destruction. The foreign physicians who witnessed these sessions later wrote accounts that would circulate through European courts, spreading Ivan's reputation as a ruler who had transcended mere cruelty to achieve something approaching scientific evil. They described a man who could discuss the theological implications of suffering while simultaneously perfecting new methods of inflicting it, a sovereign who had made psychological warfare into an art form that would terrorize enemies for generations. When Ivan the Terrible finally died in 1584, he left behind more than a kingdom. He left a scar carved so deep into Russian soil that it would bleed for generations. The numbers alone tell a story of unprecedented destruction. Conservative estimates place his death toll at over 60,000 souls, a figure that dwarfed the casualties of any European ruler in the 16th century. But statistics cannot capture the true scope of what Ivan had wrought upon his realm. The depopulation was catastrophic and systematic. Entire estates lay abandoned, their noble families either dead or fled to foreign courts where they lived as exiles, telling horrified audiences about the monster who wore the crown of Moscow. Agricultural production collapsed as peasants abandoned their fields, preferring the uncertainty of the wilderness to the certainty of death under Ivan's rule. Trade routes that had connected Russia to the wider world shifted southward and westward, merchants preferring longer journeys to the risk of encountering the Tsar's tax collectors or oprichniki patrols. The psychological damage proved even more enduring than the physical destruction. The great boyar families that had survived Ivan's purges bred lines of timid heirs, men who had learned that survival depended on invisibility and silence. The very concept of noble honor, which had once driven Russian aristocrats to challenge their rulers, withered under the weight of generational trauma. Courage became a luxury that noble families could no longer afford. When the Romanov dynasty finally rose to power in 1613, they did so on a simple but powerful pledge. Never again would Russia witness the resurrection of an oprichnina. The new Tsars understood that their legitimacy rested not on fear, but on the promise of protection from the kind of institutionalized terror that Ivan had perfected. They built their rule on the explicit rejection of everything Ivan had represented. The chronicles of the time speak of Ivan only in whispers, as if naming him too loudly might somehow summon his spirit back to the world of the living. Peasants crossed themselves when they passed the ruins of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, and mothers told their children cautionary tales about the Tsar who had eaten his own kingdom. The very name, Ivan the Terrible, became a warning passed down through generations, proof that absolute power, when wielded by a mind capable of infinite cruelty, could transform a ruler into something that transcended mere tyranny, to become a force of pure destruction. Russia had learned a lesson written in blood and burned into the collective memory of its people, that some kinds of power are too dangerous for any mortal to wield, and that the price of allowing such power to flourish is measured not in years but in centuries of national trauma.